Good morning, everyone. My name is Leroy Smith. I'm the Curriculum Instruction and Assessments Coordinator here at the Shepherd Pratt School in Towson. Welcome to our professional learning session on intentional planning, Part 1, Unpacking Standards. On instruction, the more accomplished teachers set tasks that had a greater degree of challenge. They were more sensitive to context and they had a deeper understanding of the content being taught. John Hattie. This quote is important by one of the most well-renowned researchers in the world in education, Mr. John Hattie, about what instruction can be and what it should be for students. And he talks about accomplished teachers because in order to have accomplished students, we have to have accomplished teachers. And he says that they set tasks that are a greater degree of challenge and they were sensitive to context. So that means that even though our students may have specific challenges or specific context that we're sensitive to, it doesn't mean that we don't attempt or try to implement a greater degree of challenge, but it also means we have to have a deeper understanding of the content that's being taught. So we're going to talk about that today with Unpacking Standards. Our agenda today will include, we've gone over the quotes engagement. We are reviewing the agenda right now. Next, we're going to go over our communal rights, then our learning outcomes. We're going to go to what are standards. We're going to talk about content versus skill. Then we're going to talk about the Maryland College and Career Readiness or MCCR standards. We're going to do a quick overview. We're going to do a standards analysis using Bloom's taxonomy. We're going to review our learning outcomes, and then we're going to close out. Communal rights. Every member of our community has the right to be curious, make mistakes, ask questions, be vulnerable, revise their thoughts, statements, and actions, agree or disagree with another community member, support the learning of others with their permission. Communal rights allow us to have a safe space to learn and to thrive as we are developing skills that are necessary not only for our own professional development, but for the great possibilities of meeting students' needs and pushing them to levels that they didn't anticipate themselves of going to. Learning outcomes. By the end of this workshop, participants will be able to use a working definition of academic standards, distinguish between content and skills-based standards, locate the Maryland College and Career Readiness MCCR standards online, identify standards that are aligned with their subject areas and grade levels, and analyze standards focusing on content and skills students must learn. What are academic standards? Well, according to Sarah Schwartz at Education Week, which is an online publication for educators and educational leaders throughout the country, academic standards describe what students should know and be able to do in the core academic subjects at each grade level. They can cover skills such as adding and subtracting within 100, or content like understanding the roles of the 3 branches of government. What's important here to remember about academic standards or what we're teaching is that they're looking at what the students should know. We can't anticipate what they know, but what they should know by a certain grade level and within a certain content area, and what they should be able to do with that knowledge. Not only what they should know, but what they'll be able to do at each subject, at each grade level, and that there are skills and content covered within academic standards, which we're going to get into in a moment. You can find the Maryland College and Career Readiness MCCR standards at the link below. So when you're looking here, the Maryland College and Career Readiness Standards, or MCCR, are the standards that were adopted by the Maryland State Department of Education, which is our governing agency for education in the state of Maryland for public schools. And they have academic standards aligned with college and career skills necessary for post-secondary student success. And you can locate all standards for all content areas at the link that is provided here. Please watch the video to see how you can locate the standards online by accessing this link here.
Good morning. We will focus on how to find the Maryland College and Career Readiness Standards, or MCCR, on the Maryland State Department of Education's website. So here is the URL. Here, when you go to Pages and you go to Index, you'll go to the Office of Teaching and Learning is where you want to go. The link is also included within the presentation. So once you click on this link of Office of Teaching and Learning, this is what it will look like as you see here. And then you'll see where it says Instructional Programs and Services. You want to click on that. Once you click on Instructional Programs and Services, you will see different areas appear, different subject areas, as here. So if I want to go to the math standards, the mathematics standards, if I click on mathematics, I'm going to scroll and see the contact individuals here for the standards. If I want to learn more about the MCAP, or the Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program, I can by clicking here. If I look over to the left, as you see Maryland College and Career Readiness Standards for mathematics. I'm going to click on that link to the left. And if you scroll down, you'll be able to find the standards for each grade level and or subject and curriculum frameworks here. Now this looks, if I go back, it's going to look different for a different subject area, as each subject area has its own page. Let's go to social studies. If you look over here, the information's to the right, this time not to left, and here it says here state standards and frameworks in social studies. Once again, you can click the grade levels that apply to the students that you teach, and the subjects that you teach. If you go back, I'm going to do one more. Let's do physical education. If you look here, it looks like it's off to the right, where it has resources about wellness, health counsel, wellness, physical advisory, publications. If you see here, it looks kind of like, where are the standards? If you're scrolling, usually for physical education, it's going to be, the framework is going to be here, because their department functions a little differently. But as you see here, there are standards inside this document. Standard 1, Standard 2, and this applies for elementary, middle, and high school outcomes. So that's just one way that you can find the standards on the Maryland State Department of Education's website. You go to the link that was provided, you go to Office of Teaching and Learning, and click on the subject area that applies to the areas that you teach.
Now let's talk about content versus skill. This is very important because academic standards fall into two categories. Content, the what or the knowledge of what students should gain. So content, for an example, let's use social studies. In the one content area that students must understand in social studies in the United States is federalism, how our federal, state, and local governments have their own divisions and their own authorities within their jurisdictions. That's knowledge that students should gain. So that's the content part of a standard. And standards often include content and skills combined within one statement. So we have to be clear about what students should gain in their knowledge, but also for the skill, what actions or strategies students should use to apply their knowledge. For example, one of the skills that students must do in social studies is understanding how to decipher and analyze primary and secondary sources. For example, looking at the United States Constitution and seeing how federalism is mentioned within that, not only within the secondary sources that we see it now online, but how they were originally written in the handwriting that happened over 100+ years ago. So analyzing those different sources is a skill so that they can apply their knowledge of what federalism means within the United States Constitution and other state constitutions like the Maryland State Constitution. Let's look at an example of an academic standard based upon content and skill for a high school U.S. history class. So for standard number 5, there's a focus on industrialization in the U.S. history class. And one of the essential questions is, did the benefits of post-Civil War industrialization outweigh the cost? That's a pretty tricky question. But let's look at some of the content that was listed when you go on MSDE's website at Maryland Public Schools. .org and you look for the social studies standards from the MCCR standards. When you look at standard 5 for U.S. history, the content that's mentioned is laissez-faire capitalism, urbanization, industrialization, and immigration. So students must gain knowledge about laissez-faire capitalism, urbanization, industrialization, and immigration. However, students must also learn these strategies and implement these actions to apply their knowledge. They have to evaluate the impact of inventions and policies for the post-Civil War industrialization era. They must also identify responses to political realities. There were different political realities for those who were newly freed people from slavery that are of African descent. There were different political realities for the indigenous and First Nation people who were losing land. There were different political realities for white Southerners who were a part of the Confederacy who lost some of their land or their lives or loved ones, and as well as the Union. There were different political realities for immigrants that were coming over shortly after the end of the Civil War. So students have to be able to identify those different political realities, but also evaluating the impact of inventions like the cotton gin and also locating oil and using oil as a power source. So as you see, this one standard, this one big question has a lot within it. And so remember when we talked about this earlier about teachers have to, really skilled teachers have to develop an understanding of what the content they're teaching and the skills necessary to access that content, but also that we can have a level of rigor here that is reasonable. Perhaps you're only focusing on for a week industrialization and what that means with steel and railroads and oil production and things of that sort. And perhaps you're just only evaluating the impact of those inventions and policies. So it gives us an understanding that this standard has a lot to it, and we need to break this standard up over the course of days or weeks for our students, depending on their present levels of performance and functional aptitudes. So content versus skill is super important when we're looking at academic standards, because this helps us unpack what students need to gain in knowledge, but also what actions and strategies students need to apply that knowledge or to access that knowledge. Academic standard considerations. When we intentionally plan lessons, we must consider the present levels of academic and functional performance of students. Not all students will be ready for that academic standard that we just talked about for looking at the post-Civil War era. Not all students might be ready for that standard, or that maybe students are ready for the content but need help with the skills, like evaluating the impact of inventions and technologies at the time. That might be a little bit more tricky. So we have to consider the functional and academic levels of our students. Next, the cognitive demand or load on students' executive functioning skills. All this means is how much information are students expected to process and do something with at a time. Perhaps doing a lesson on laissez-faire capitalism and immigration is a lot, and it'll be a lot for you to teach and a lot for them to learn. So part of being an exceptional teacher is deciding what part of the standard do I want to address right now and today, and how do I want to extend that learning over time so that I'm not overwhelming my students, because their executive functioning skills are talking about how they plan, how they organize, how they make decisions, how they process the information, how they set goals. And if I'm giving them too much content or too many skills to master at one time, it's going to be an overload for their executive functioning skills, which might show up as more distractions, some verbal complaints, some physicality where students want to get up and leave, students checking out of the assignment. But if it's a very specific niche, we're only talking about this one thing and really getting good at this one thing, that's great. Sometimes it might mean that that academic standard that you're only talking about industrialization, like you're just giving pictures and vocabulary and building that background knowledge so that they can access and do something with that standard once we get to the skills part of it. So that's what that means sometimes, is understanding that students can only take but so much, just like teachers and adults can only take but so much at one time. The next consideration is the application of the academic standards within academic and non-academic settings. For example, industrialization is super important, not only just during the post-Civil War era, but also now in the year 2023, when we're talking about the rise of artificial intelligence and how that's having both positive and negative impacts in the industrial sectors. That's, or we could talk about industrial policy where people have lost their jobs under policies like NAFTA, where some jobs were sent across seas for trade deals with other countries and bilateral agreements. So as you see, and that impacts students who might be going out into the workforce in a unionized job where some of their jobs are being excised out to other countries because of these kind of policies that are in the industrial field. So we can't just think about how does this standard apply to the content I'm teaching of that historical period or right now in class, but how will this knowledge and these skills benefit students beyond the academic setting? Because the Maryland College and Career Readiness Standards are not just about preparing students for college, it's about preparing students for careers and understanding that this information will serve them well throughout their lives, whether they choose to go to college or not. Next, the relevancy of the content to students' personal experiences. Perhaps you have students in your class who their family might be immigrants or first generation immigrants. So in that case, what you want to do is relate it to students' personal experiences so that they can see that this is important, that what happened after the Civil War for immigration led the way to some of the immigration wins and losses and concerns that we are experiencing today in the year 2023, so they can make the connection to see why it's relevant to learn about a period that was over 100 plus years ago. And lastly, the language and communication skills necessary to access the standards. This kind of goes back to the present levels of academic and functional performance. But I wanted to call out the language and communication skills because students have different dialects, they speak different languages, they use body language. Some students may not want to use their voice, they might want to use hand gestures or sign language. Understanding this will help you better understand as a teacher how to meet their needs, how to support them when learning about industrialization or immigration. Perhaps part of the immigration, part of the standard, you might want to, if you have some students who speak Spanish, ask them about what does it mean, or how do you define, or how do you say immigration in Spanish. Bringing them in and making this relevant to them, but also making it digestible to them in a way that resonates with them. Now we're going to talk about standards analysis. Analyzing standards using Bloom's taxonomy, which is a hierarchical framework of complexity within cognition. All that means is that from our cognitive abilities that all human beings have, we have kind of lower level thinking skills. As cognition is just how a person thinks and processes information. We have lower level skills such as remembering, like what's today's date, or is today Monday or Tuesday. Then we have all the way up to the top of the level is creation, where people are creating beautiful portraits or songs or blueprints for buildings, where it requires a lot of cognitive awareness and thinking. And so we're looking at this because the Bloom's taxonomy framework informs educators on the levels of rigor involved for content and skills within a standard. So the levels of rigor just means the levels of challenge. So remember what I said before in the previous slide, we want to consider students' present levels of academic and functional performance. So that means we have to know how much is too much for students within this standard. Is it too much to do this, or is it not enough for this? Is it just right? We want to find that just right space within the standard. So let's look at a math standard here, which is 6 RP for ratios and proportions, A1. Understand the concept of a ratio and use ratio language to describe a ratio relationship between two quantities. For example, the ratio of wings to beaks in the birdhouse at the zoo is 2:1, because for every 2 wings, there was 1 beak. For every vote candidate A received, candidate C received nearly 3 votes. So here students are expected, this is a math standard, and we're going to analyze it under the 2 categories we spoke about before, content and skills. The content is that students are interpreting the relationship between 2 quantities as a ratio. So they have to really grasp, what is a ratio? And what do I do with a ratio? What is that thing I have to do? That's the skill. So let's look at the content. The content is going to this application stage. It's in between really the application and understand stage, because they have to understand what a ratio is, but they have to also apply that knowledge to real world context, such as the voting for a candidate, or the beaks to feet for birds in the birdhouse, or wings to a beak in the birdhouse. So they have to apply it and interpret it. And when you're interpreting, you're in between this understanding and application phase within the Bloom's taxonomy. So it's not at the bottom, which is the kind of lower level thinking. This standard is already kind of taking kids midway of level of complexity and rigor here. So you have to consider that with your students. Are students at this point with ratios? Are they still remembering? Are they still remembering that a ratio is a math term? Are they still remembering what a ratio is? If they're still at the remember stage, this lesson that you might use for this standard is going to look different. You're probably just going to be focusing on identifying ratios and looking at ratios and saying, is this a ratio? Is it not a ratio? Is this a ratio? Is it not a ratio? But at the application stage, now you're at the part with, you're giving examples like there are 2 wings for every 1 beak. in the zoo, and now you're saying that there are spiders in the zoo. There are 8 legs for every one body. So now you're interpreting different examples of this. Let's look at some of the skills for this standard. So the skills for the standard are speaking about ratios, because they have to describe the ratios, so they have to talk about this. This is at this understanding and remembering. It's in between understanding and remembering. So as you see, the skills can help us access greater complexity within the content, writing ratios as blank, colon, blank. So looking at the relationship between those two quantities. So these skills of speaking and writing are in between understanding and remembering. Using those skills can help students access the deeper context and rigor of interpretation. So if you can speak about something and write about something, it's easier than to interpret what those things might be. So as you see, Bloom's taxonomy allows us to see how complex are these different standards when we're unpacking the content and the skills. Where are my students here with this standard? Are they still at the remember stage, or do I have some students who are at the evaluation stage? Are they ready for more of a challenge? And you might have students who are ready for different parts of this taxonomy, because remember, it's a hierarchical framework. So you may have students at any given point be at any given point within this standard. They can be at the top level, they're ready to create their own examples around ratios, or they could be at the bottom level where they're just trying to talk about ratios and identify them. That's okay, but the standard gives us a concept of where students should be within this. So they should be anywhere between the remember up to apply part of this taxonomy hierarchy to see how they can access this standard. Let's review our learning outcomes as we're coming to the end of this professional learning session. You can respond to yourself silently. Did you use a working definition of academic standards? Did you distinguish between content and skills-based standards? Did you locate the Maryland College and Career Readiness MCCR standards online? Did you identify standards that are aligned with your or their subject areas and grade levels? Did you analyze standards focusing on the content and skills students must learn? Take a moment and just have a brief reflection to yourself to see, did you accomplish those outcomes during this professional learning? As we close, I want to put some attention here to the QR code that you can scan with your phone or tablet for the feedback form for today's session. So thank you for participating in today's professional learning opportunity. I'm very grateful that you viewed this, if you're viewing it asynchronously. Also, part 2 of this professional learning series will give you resources and strategies to write learning objectives that are standards-based. So first, you want to unpack the standards so we understand the skills and the content that students need to gain, and also the actions and strategies to help them apply that knowledge. And then we want to go into the learning objectives. So building out learning objectives that students are going to do from the standard. So we're going to talk about that in part 2. So you can pull from the standard and figure out which skills do you need to address, what contents do you need to address, and how do you communicate that with students. Not that we just post them on the board, but how do we involve students in understanding what content and skills that they're held accountable for learning. Lastly, complete the feedback form to receive credit for completing this professional learning session. The only way that you're going to get credit for this session and acknowledgement of completion is if you complete the feedback form. The feedback form is live now. So if you click on this link or you access it to the QR code, you will be able to complete the feedback form. It is very brief. We're looking for feedback on how to improve this professional learning for you. And if we need to re-record it or redo this session, we will do that to make it better for you and others. And also feedback for future sessions so we can make those more tailored to meet your professional needs. Thank you for attending today's Intentional Planning Part 1 Unpacking Standards. I'm so glad that you made it today. Please take the time to complete your feedback form so we can receive feedback from you to improve this professional learning and other professional learning offerings. Thank you so much and have a great day.